Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this important effort and for tonight's community info session. My name is Jason Sartori, and I am the Chief of the Countywide Planning and Policy Division at the Montgomery County Planning Department. And we have several of our staff here this evening, and in a minute or so, I'll take a moment to introduce them all to you. Before we begin, I do want to note that we are recording this meeting to help with our note keeping, but also so that we can post it to our website so people who are unable to attend this evening can watch it to be informed. So please let people know that as well who are unable to attend tonight. Okay, so here's a quick outline of our agenda for this community meeting. After introductions, I'll spend some time talking about the previous and ongoing housing efforts at the Planning Department, and then I'll talk more specifically about the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative. I'm then going to pass it off to Lisa Gavoni, our lead housing planner at the Planning Department, to provide some definition to the types of housing we are targeting with this effort. She will also walk through some data that identify the need for more of a variety of housing types in the county. We'll then close out the meeting with a Q&A session, but feel free to submit your questions at any point during the presentation. We may answer some of those questions midstream, but others we will save until the end. To ask a question, just follow these two steps on the screen here. First, click on the Q&A box that is located in the top right corner of your window to participate in the moderated Q&A. The box should look something like this with a question mark inside some quotes. Then from the Featured tab, click Ask a Question. This will move you over to the My Questions tab where you can type a question or a comment. If you joined anonymously, we ask that you type in your name so that the moderator will know who you are. And then just click the send icon, which looks like this arrow, and that will send your message to the moderator. Unfortunately, those of you who are participating on the phone are unable to follow, or you're able to follow along with the discussion, but you can't see our slides or submit a question. At the end of the presentation, I'll provide our email addresses so that you can reach out to us, and we'll be sure to post this presentation to our website as well. Now, I've already introduced myself, so let me introduce the rest of the Montgomery planning team, an outstanding team, I have to say. I mentioned Lisa Gavoni before. For this project, she is the primary lead for data and policy analysis. Ben Berbert, who is currently out of the office and not on this call, is our lead zoning expert on the project. Todd Foley-King with our Research and Strategic Projects Division is taking the lead on market feasibility. And Zubin Adrianvala is from our Mid-County Planning Division and is taking the lead on incentives and other catalyst policies. Behind the scenes today, we have Casey Rohn from our Historic Preservation section serving as the producer of tonight's meeting, and Arnita Jackson providing phone line assistance to people who have called in. Thank you to both of you guys for helping us out this evening. Bridget Breuer is another key member of our team, but she is not on today's call. She is the chief of our communications division at the Planning Department. But joining us today, we do have Tanya Stern, Planning's Deputy Director, and Gwen Wright, who is the Director of the Planning Department. Thank you all for being here to help answer questions. I would like to begin by setting a little bit of context. We've conducted a number of efforts in recent years related to housing policy. This includes several housing studies evaluating different aspects of housing in the county. All of these efforts have been described as pieces of the housing puzzle, with no one piece being the ultimate solution to our housing concerns. We need all the pieces to solve the puzzle. And the product of this initiative is just one more piece of that puzzle, but certainly not the only piece. As you can tell, the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative is part of an ongoing, extensive, multi-year effort by the county and planning department. The point I want to make on that is that there is context here. In 2018, the county updated its moderately priced dwelling unit policy to require higher shares of affordable housing in areas of the county with higher income levels. In 2019, the council approved a change to our zoning code to make it easier for property owners to add accessory dwelling units to their properties, whether attached or detached to the primary residence. Also in 2019, the county joined forces with other regional jurisdictions to agree to a set of housing targets for the region. And then last year, the council adopted the new Growth and Infrastructure Policy, which is our policy that implements our Adequate Public Facilities Ordinance. One of the most significant changes in that policy was the elimination of our residential development moratorium. And finally, next Thursday, the Planning Board is expected to approve its draft of Thrive Montgomery 2050, the county's most comprehensive update to our general plan in more than 50 years. A major element of that plan is a focus on increasing the diversity of housing in our county to improve opportunities for more people. In many ways, the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative serves as the county's first opportunity to ensure that Thrive, which is the result of an extensive amount of public and community input over the last couple of years, both pre and post-pandemic input, that it's actually implemented. I mentioned on the previous slide that we've conducted numerous housing studies over the last 5 years. After all of these studies, the rental housing study from 2017, the housing for older adults study in 2018, also in 2018, our missing middle housing study, last year our housing needs assessment and the preservation of affordable housing study, and most recently the residential development capacity analysis. After all of these studies, it is now time for action. The first step was to create the vision. That is Thrive Montgomery 2050, which establishes the county's vision for our future. If you will, it is the image we are putting together with our different puzzle pieces. Some of those puzzle pieces are already in place. Those are the other policies we've adopted in recent years. This effort, the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative, is another big piece in our effort to complete the housing puzzle envisioned in Thrive. We've also spent the better part of the last 3 years working on missing middle housing. Lisa will talk more about what missing middle means in a little bit, but we've been guided in many ways by the missing middle housing study that I mentioned earlier from 2018. But we've also had several recent master plans with elements focused on missing middle. The Forest Glen and Veers Mill plans both address missing middle housing as part of the plans. However, in the absence of zones or development process specifically targeting missing middle housing, we've had to rely on rezoning parcels to mixed-use zones to be able to allow the desired housing product. And that's not ideal. Part of this effort is to identify better ways to achieve the desired housing variety. We are also looking at addressing missing middle through our ongoing Silver Spring downtown and adjacent communities plan, which has included a market analysis that has provided valuable insight into the feasibility of building or obtaining different types of housing. As mentioned earlier, Thrive Montgomery 2050 has a major focus on housing, including the addition of missing middle housing. And finally, Zoning Text Amendment 2007, which was introduced last year by Councilmember Will Jawando, directly addressed missing middle around metro stations, whereas a draft amendment by Councilmember Reamer facilitates missing middle housing along our main corridors. The point is that there is a breadth of efforts related to missing middle housing here. This is not an impulsive or spontaneous effort. In fact, this effort that we're doing here with Attainable Housing Strategies is intended to comprehensively and cohesively weave many of these different efforts together. So let's talk a little bit more about what it is we're doing with this initiative. As you've seen, there have been a lot of efforts over the last few years in Montgomery County and frankly across the entire country to spur the development of more housing. Ultimately, the County Council clearly believes this is a ripe opportunity to develop a strategy to diversify the county's housing stock. In light of the county's desire to take action, the Council sent us a request to consider and recommend, quote, zoning reforms that would allow greater opportunities for missing middle housing in Montgomery County. And so the Planning Department responded by creating the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative to prepare a path forward to diversifying our housing, to identify viable options for more existing and future residents of the county to find homes at the right sizes, the right locations, and the right price points for their needs. And key to this is expanding opportunities for homeownership in the county. So this is not just rental units, but for sale units that provide previously marginalized communities with increased opportunities, particularly for building wealth. The market in Montgomery County has not done well in providing housing options for middle-income households, first-time home buyers, and residents who want to downsize and age in place. If you have a high income level, housing in Montgomery County is certainly attainable, but it's not so for others. And given that Montgomery County is a mature suburban county with limited opportunities for greenfield development, this effort needs to be focused on growing our housing supply in places with limited available space. So this is the question before us. How can we diversify and expand our housing options in Montgomery County? And with that, that will be followed by questions about what type of housing, where should it be located, what needs to be changed to allow it to happen, what needs to change to make it feasible or even likely to happen. Part of doing this is that we reassess our longstanding patterns of residential development in the county. So that means we need to look at neighborhoods that have been zoned exclusively for single-family homes, and we need to understand our ability to densify our corridors with more diverse infill housing as well. And so we will be looking at our zoning code and reviewing the development standards that we have in place that pertain to the usable area of a lot, the size of a structure, including height, the setbacks required from property lines, the allowable density in a zone, and parking requirements. We also need to look at the development review process as part of this and how that comes into play in obtaining the desired housing. These are all concepts that have been identified previously through our studies and other initiatives, and people will have opportunities to provide feedback on specific proposals later in the process as we start to hone in on our specific solutions. And I don't think I can emphasize enough that at the root of this is an effort to make our communities more equitable and more inclusive. The historical discriminatory aspects of zoning are not lost on us. Zoning determines what can be built where, and by limiting housing options, we have limited who has access to different neighborhoods, which has led to neighborhoods that are homogeneous racially, ethnically, and economically. As Howard County housing advocate Tom Cole indicated in a recent op-ed in the Baltimore Sun, housing policy is key to diversifying our communities and our schools. Jurisdictions in states all across the country, from California to Massachusetts and from Minnesota to Texas, are pursuing efforts to undo the discriminatory impacts of zoning. But this is not easy given decades of entrenched development patterns in a mature suburban county like Montgomery County. But it's not only about zoning. Discriminatory lending practices and restrictive covenants have also led to deep disparities in wealth and homeownership. And making homeownership more attainable with more equitable mixed income neighborhoods is one way that we can work to reverse these historical inequities. One thing to keep in mind is that the attainable housing we're talking about in this effort, and Lisa will help provide more of a definition to this in a few minutes, is not income restricted affordable housing. It's market rate housing that generally will be more affordable than the typical new detached single family home due to its smaller size. And so while it doesn't address affordable housing, other pieces of the puzzle, the other pieces do that. This effort will still provide opportunities to make homeownership attainable to more households. So this is our general timeline for this project. You can tell that we have a very tight turnaround, having committed to transmitting recommendations to the County Council by the end of June. And while this may seem very ambitious, we don't feel like we're starting from scratch, as indicated earlier. And the vast majority of our major milestones and activities that you'll see here relate to gathering feedback from the community and other stakeholders. We have 2 other community meetings scheduled for April 21st and May 24th. While tonight's meeting is more of an info session with a moderated Q&A, we may incorporate other formats for future meetings, such as breakout rooms for roundtable discussions. We also have virtual office hours, 2 in April, one in the beginning of April, one at the end of April, and then one in June. And these will provide people with a more personal opportunity to ask questions and provide comments. We've also created an external advisory team called the Housing Equity Advisory Team, or HEAT. The HEAT consists of county residents that approach this issue from different perspectives. It includes developers, both for-profit and nonprofit, a realtor, civic activists, housing activists, an economist, and someone from the banking industry. While the HEAT will not be asked to come to a consensus or to make recommendations to the planning board, we are hopeful that it will provide planning staff with an understanding of the different perspectives and knowledge about that's out there about housing policy. And ultimately, planning staff will present our recommendations to the planning board in June, at which point people will also have additional opportunities to provide comments directly to the board. It is anticipated that the County Council will take up any policy review in the fall, which will again afford people another opportunity to provide feedback before any policy is implemented. And so now I'm going to turn it over to Lisa Gavoni.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Lisa Gavoni, and I work on housing policy for the department. You've probably noticed by now that the initiative is titled Attainable Housing Strategies, and it's not solely focused on missing middle. So what is attainable housing? Next slide. Attainable housing is unsubsidized market rate housing that is appropriate and suitable for the households that live here. As Jason mentioned, attainable housing is not income restricted housing. There is a growing recognition that, of course, yes, we need to build as much income restricted housing as possible, but we just need to build more housing, period. Generally, attainable housing will be more affordable than the typical new detached single family home due to its smaller size and smaller lot area. And implicit in this idea of attainability is that a range of housing options, which includes type, size, tenure, and cost, exists in the local market for a range of household incomes and preferences. Attainable housing includes, but is not limited to, missing middle housing. And we'll go over the scale and types of housing included in the term attainable housing in future slides. Next slide. As part of attainability, a big part of attainability is missing middle housing, which is housing that generally refers to a range of building types that are compatible in scale, form, and construction with single-family homes, but include multiple housing units. Missing middle housing can provide a transition from low-density single-family neighborhoods to high-density apartment, retail, and office districts. The best opportunities to create house-scale missing middle potentially include changes to the single-family zones in these transition areas to allow for missing middle housing production. And to be clear, these actions will not eliminate single-family neighborhoods. It may result in some single-family homes being replaced in a compatible form if the property owner decides to take advantage of future zoning changes, or if a developer combines multiple properties. The goal of missing middle housing is to allow Montgomery County residents to access more choices in housing to meet their needs. Next slide. One question we are continually asked is if missing middle already exists in Montgomery County, and the answer is yes. Missing middle was common during the pre-World War II era, but it's largely disappeared in new construction in recent decades, with most new construction comprised of either single-family homes or taller multifamily apartment buildings. We can say that about at least 17% of Montgomery County's housing stock could be defined as missing middle housing, having 2 to 19 units in the structure. And this number comes from the American Community Survey. And it may be obvious from the outside that it may not be obvious from the outside that these buildings have multiple housing units because they typically blend in with the scale and size of the surrounding homes. Missing middle is common in places like East Silver Spring, Tacoma Park, and Chevy Chase, and is commonly found in the form of accessory dwelling units, duplexes, triplexes, and small apartment buildings. Next slide. When we talk about attainable housing, this graphic is a great representation of how we're visualizing in terms of scale. It's the famous Opticos missing middle diagram modified to show various scales of housing. We want to create a vision that is unique to the housing landscape in Montgomery County that we want to see. So we are working on our own version of this graphic that we hope to provide to the community soon. For this initiative, we primarily want to focus on the types of housing we are not getting. This includes duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes at the house scale end, but also the products on the right side of this picture that are not house scale and are more appropriate to line our transit corridors. These include products like stacked triplexes, or 2/2. We want to focus on the house scale product in our single family neighborhoods, but also the larger scale product that we would like to see on our BRT corridors. Next slide. Just to go over the scale a little bit more, small scale usually means house scale. It's a duplex, triplex, fourplex, courtyard apartments, bungalow courts, and accessory dwelling units that are typically 2 to 2.5 stories high. We also have medium scale, which is stacked flats apartments, 2/2s, larger townhouses, and more that are 3 to 4 stories. On the large scale end, we have mixed use, live work buildings, stacked flat apartment buildings that are generally 4 to 5 stories high. With the various scales of attainable housing, there is obviously some overlap between the different scale, but this implicit in this idea of a range of attainable housing is that Montgomery County has diverse housing with diverse housing needs, and we'll be examining what that mix looks like throughout this initiative. Next slide. Here's an example of a small-scale attainable housing. We have an accessory dwelling unit in the Kentlands and a triplex in Silver Spring. You can see that they are house scale, generally 2 to 2.5 stories in height. Next slide. And then we have median scale. This includes townhouses, a product we are very familiar with here in Montgomery County. But we also have some 2/2s in Kentlands. If you look at that, you can see that it looks from the outside like a townhouse, but you can tell that it's a 2/2 based on the doors, and you see the number of doors that go to the top floor and the bottom floor. And we like this because it's an example of, a gentle density it's a little bit denser than the townhouse product, but from the outside, it looks like it fits in with the townhouse scale. Next slide. This is a project that we really like on Georgia Avenue near Walt Reed. You can't tell from the outside, but there's actually 3 stack units on top of each other. And this is the type of product that we envision to see along our BRT corridors. It's certainly not house scale or appropriate for the interior of a residential neighborhood, but this is a gentle density from the outside that looks like luxury townhouses, but each column is actually 3 stacked units. Next slide. So why do we need zoning changes in Montgomery County? Generally speaking, many of the existing missing middle housing structures could not be built under the standards of single-family zones today. While many of the single-family zones do allow some types of missing middle housing, namely duplexes and triplexes, there are additional requirements to build missing middle types in the single-family zone. These requirements do not exist to build a tear-down rebuild of a single-family detached unit, but these additional requirements include process. It requires discretionary planning department review to achieve these building types through something we call the optional method of development, which generally means instead of going straight to the Department of Permitting Services to get your permit to build a duplex, you have to come to the planning department for review. There's also affordable housing requirements for the optional method of development. Even if the project is less than 20 units. This added cost of small projects will often make it too costly or infeasible to build the product. There's also usable area requirements. Optional method projects also have usable area requirements that require finding or assembling about 3 to 5 acres, which is increasingly difficult in most of our transit accessible neighborhoods down county. For example, the R60 zone requires 3 acres of usable area. Now, when we talk about the larger scale side of attainable housing, the type of housing that we're looking to line our corridors, zoning might not be the hurdle, but the hurdles might be more market-based. Again, attainable housing refers to a broad range of housing, and we want to, through this initiative, look at the various impediments to building this product, which includes looking at not only zoning, but the market too. Next slide. One of the biggest reasons attainable housing is important is because Montgomery County's communities have diverse needs in terms of housing. This includes affordability and the size and type of housing. It's also a great way to increase access to homeownership. The units are typically smaller in size than a newer single-family detached unit, and their smaller size can help them make them more affordable. One example I always like to use, which is not a missing middle product, but did have smaller units, is the Octave, an adapter for use condo building in Silver Spring. The units average around 500 to 800 square feet, and because of their small size, they were more affordable. They're an entry-level product. Many of them sold for under $300,000, and many went to first-time home buyers. Missing middle and attainable housing is also a gentle density that allows the county to increase its housing supply. The county has not built enough housing to keep up with demand, and current housing options are often not affordable or attainable to middle income residents, making it difficult for existing residents to remain in the county. Attainable housing can provide new housing options for existing and new residents to find homes at the right size and price point for their needs and to help Montgomery County grow its housing supply. There are also environmental benefits. Allowing more density near employment and transit can help reduce vehicles miles traveled. Finally, and we mentioned this earlier, but building attainable housing is an important step for the county to take in addressing past inequities in housing choice and recognizing the deep disparities that were created from redlining and the legacy of single-family zoning. Next slide. When we talk about the need for attainable housing, we're going to start with this slide. If you've ever been to a planning department housing presentation, you've probably seen this slide because we think it's a really important point. It shows that our declining housing production by decade and where we need to be to meet the COG housing goals that Jason mentioned earlier. We think making it easier to build attainable housing in the county is a huge step to help increasing our housing production and to meet the housing demand. Next slide. We've mentioned today that one of the things we want to do is highlight with the Attainable Housing Strategies Initiative is this idea of increasing access to homeownership. And this chart really highlights this need. It's from our recently completed housing needs assessment. And it shows that the household income required to afford the median home value in Montgomery County is $20,000 more than the actual median household income. And another thing that I always like to show on this graph is you can see that the median household income has remained relatively flat, but you can also see that home prices have increased during the same time. Next slide. In 2020, the average detached home was sold for almost $800,000. This is compared to $370,000 for attached home structures. The graph on the screen shows the various housing sale prices for houses sold in 2020. You have the blue bar showing condos, the orange bar showing detached structures, and the green bar showing attached structures. From this graph, you can tell that most attached structures were sold for under $400,000, whereas most detached structures were sold for over $600,000. We're showing this to highlight the differences between the various structure types and the impact of size and type on affordability. Next slide. At the same time, single-family homes are getting larger in Montgomery County, increasing by over 130% in gross floor area since the typical home built in the 1950s. I want to note that a lot of these larger homes that are being built today are tear-down rebuilds, which is when a smaller, relatively more affordable single-family home is torn down and replaced with a much larger, more expensive home. Under current zoning, this is allowed by right, which means that you can go straight to the department services for a building permit, and it requires no review by the planning department. It's a relatively easy process as compared to the additional processes highlighted earlier required to build missing middle types in these same zones. The hope with this project is that with a lot of these tear down rebuilds that occur today, in the future, it will result in multiple more housing units being built than a rebuild of a more expensive single family detached structure. If we don't make the necessary changes now, we run the risk of our neighborhoods losing the diversity that we've heard from so many of you that you cherish. Slowly over time, neighborhoods will transform through the tear down rebuild process that will result in a loss of affordability in these neighborhoods. Even small, modest numbers of duplexes and triplexes could help combat this loss of affordability. Next slide. I'm going to turn it back over to Mr. Sartori to go through possible implementation tools.
Okay, thank you, Lisa. So there's been a lot of talk already about the need for policy change, and here is a slide that gives you a sense of the types of things that we'll be looking at over the next few months. There's a variety of policy tools that allow and encourage more diverse housing types. So we'll talk about zoning text amendments, or ZTAs, which are changes to the text of the zoning ordinance. The changes generally fall into three categories. One's like Councilmember Jawando's ZTA, which changed the uses allowed in existing zones. The second type includes ZTAs like Councilmember Reamer's, which changed the development standards and what's allowed based on the application method and benefits provided by the developer. And the third, which creates a new zone for the desired land uses, which can then be applied to particular areas of the county. That last type of ZTA requires rezoning of land, which occurs in two ways. First, following council adoption of a master plan when we implement zoning changes through what is called the sectional map amendment. We also have local map amendments, which are rezonings requested by a property owner for a specific parcel outside of the master plan process. And then we'll also talk about other policies that can help encourage or facilitate production of the type of housing we would like to see. And again, as we actually start to develop these policies, we'll have more opportunities to engage in and discuss those options, those policy solutions with people. And so before we turn over to the Q&A, I just want to encourage you all to stay involved. Again, we have virtual office hours set up the first two, April 9th and April 27th. You can RSVP for that, and that'll give you an opportunity to have more of a one-on-one or maybe one-on-a-few type of conversation with us. You could also RSVP to the next community meeting, and the focus that will be different again as we move further along in the project. You could also sign up for our housing e-letter, and you can do all of these things by visiting our Attainable Housing Strategies website, which is at montgomeryplanning.org. And for those of you that are on the phone line, again, if you go to montgomeryplanning.org, it's pretty easy. We've got it in the circulating images that you'll be able to find our webpage. And if you've got any questions that aren't answered by the Q&A tonight, feel free to reach out to me or Lisa. Lisa's email address is lisa.govoni@montgomeryplanning.org. Her last name is spelled Govoni, and mine is jason.sartori@montgomeryplanning.org. My last name is spelled Sartori. And so with that, I think we can turn over to the Q&A. If I just switch something here, take a look to see the questions that we've had that you guys have submitted. The first question I'm going to actually turn to Todd to see if you can answer. I got to find the question here. I lost it. Nope. Okay, well, I'll find the first question that I see. This one's for Lisa, actually. Is there a plan to update the COG housing target considering the economic or jobs impact of COVID, or is it anticipated that the Montgomery County portion of the housing target will still hold true?
That's a great question. I'm actually, if it's okay, I'm going to ask Director Wright if she could take this. She's on the COG Planning Houses Director Committee and would know more about this than I would.
Thanks. At this point, I do not believe COG is planning on updating the housing targets. They have been looking at ways to begin to assess whether the targets are being met. There are some new tools to do that. In terms of population growth, which is really what's driving our housing targets, we have not seen big changes in that. Maybe as we get additional census information, that may help us, but this part of the country continues to be, very desirable from an economic standpoint. And although we, worry about it slowing down, it's actually pretty strong in comparison to other parts of the country. And so we believe that our housing, our population estimates are probably going to continue to be pretty close to what we have, what we've estimated in terms of new population coming into the region. And that's what's driving those housing targets.
Okay, thank you. So the next question, I found the question for you, Todd. The question is, how can attainable housing really be achieved or built on land that is so expensive, i.e. land near metro stations?
Thank you for that question, Jason. So it's absolutely the case that land in the entire Washington, D.C. region is very expensive. It is the case that land tends to be more expensive near metro because metro provides access, and access is an amenity that people desire. So there's lots of demand to be near it. And we do need to recognize that there really is a floor or a bottom limit to what the private sector can do to provide housing. They cannot build housing for less than it costs to acquire land, to acquire the materials, to compensate the labor that's required. And that to some degree we are an expensive region, in part because of that. I think that the issue that we face here is not just how can we make housing as cheap as possible, but it's what sort of housing are we allowing, and are we promoting near areas, and that some housing is inherently less costly to acquire and to live in than others. I mean, particularly if it is not as large, if the lot sizes are smaller. And so there's a comparative factor here that, you know, even if missing middle in the Washington D.C. region is more expensive than we would like, you know, just because all housing is more expensive than we'd like, it is less expensive than the comparative new homes that are much, much larger.
So Todd, actually, if I could stick with you here, we got another question. It says, it's great that we are advocating for a wide range of missing middle housing, but developers have made it clear that they only want to build large buildings with many units. In other words, duplexes and triplexes are unlikely to happen because developers will not make enough money. How do you reconcile these two realities?
Well, I'd not agree with those as the realities. That's a vastly oversimplified understanding of the development market. It's absolutely correct that there are development companies that are quite large, that are very well capitalized, have lots of resources, and for whom any project that is less than, you know, multiple hundreds of units is just not interesting. And yes, those companies would not be interested in doing missing middle. But there is a very large sector of builders who do not have that same size of organization or resources, and who focus on doing small projects, who do single family home rebuild. And some of those developers, not all, but a good number, you know, absolutely are interested in products that are more than just a single unit on a project, and would be interested in missing middle, but only if it can provide a comparable level of profit with a comparable level of effort as it takes to build a single family home. You know, it's sort of a comparable risk as well. And so there are builders who are interested in this and who would do it if we could provide a pathway that is similar to what it takes to build a single family home.
Thank you, Todd. Lisa, I'm going to come back to you now on a question we had about townhomes and whether those units are also getting larger, like the data you showed with the single family detached homes.
Sure, that's a great question. I haven't looked at it as extensively as I have a single family detached. I think that certainly townhouses are getting larger in some parts of the county, but I also think that there are instances where we're getting smaller. That's something that we will be looking at through the scope of this initiative, is looking at all the housing types and how big they're growing and analyzing the trends. So I would say stay tuned and I'll be able to give a complete answer on that soon, but that's a great question.
Okay, let's see, a couple other questions here that what is the average cost per square foot for an attached home and a detached home? It seems that just comparing the sales price doesn't answer the affordability question. Who on the team would like to tackle that?
I suspect that question more heads towards me. I'm not sure that I fully follow it. I mean, I think, you know, we have numbers of what builders are penciling in to do single family home rebuilds and what they're penciling in to do townhomes. I'm not sure that level of detail is overly useful in this call. I mean, I'd say it is more expensive per square foot to do a multifamily unit because of how what the building codes require. It's a little bit more complex. But because those units tend to be a little bit smaller, at the end of the day, they tend to be less expensive in total than the single family home. Does that sort of get what at the answer that they're looking for, Jason?
It may. Yeah, we'll see if they, the person who asked that question, if you've got a follow up or if you'd like to know more, go ahead and post that to the Q&A as well. Lisa, there was a question here that I was going to come back to you on. That you can talk maybe a little bit about the affordable housing, the preservation of affordable housing study that we did. The question was, each year we lose more affordable housing than we can build. How do we preserve the affordable housing we already have?
That's a great question, and one that we just tackled in our recently completed preservation of affordable housing study, and I will reply with a link to that study and to the comment. The interesting thing about Montgomery County's preservation is that, yes, we are certainly losing units, but not at a rate that you would think. We are actually gaining more than we are losing, mostly due to the success of the moderately priced dwelling unit ordinance. We actually have, like, I believe, a net gain of 500 units if the forecast holds true. But certainly preservation is a huge tool, a huge part of our toolkit, and we will be looking at ways to increase preservation with our relationship with the Department of Housing and Community Affairs, through master plans, through the completed study. So preservation is still a part of this, the housing toolkit, but it's just not the focus of this an attainable housing strategy today. But I will put a link to the study.
Okay, and we had a question also that I'm going to turn to Zubin to see if you want to maybe talk about. Scott asks about, what about community land trusts?
Hi, yeah, community land trusts are an effective tool. I think they do have a certain lag time before the legal structure is set up. And of course, there's a certain capital requirement on part of the trust. So in a region where there could be potential capital pooled together, community land trust remains a viable alternative. The questions around zoning changes and the ability to build the stock that a community land trust can manage will still remain. So we could have a very nationally successful community land trust, but we'll still need to provide them with the product to continue to make housing attainable. And that's where the size questions that Lisa and Jason have been addressing in the presentation become really critical.
Thank you, Zubin. Okay, we did have a couple of other questions about the projections, the COG projections. So I'm going to put this out there to see who wants to tackle this. Well, the first question is that the COG population growth projections are not consistent with the Census Bureau's. How can Montgomery County advocate such extreme changes based on perhaps questionable projections? And then the next question relates to the round 9.2 numbers. Did COG use the yet to be published round 9.2 numbers? If so, please release the Montgomery County numbers as soon as possible.
So Jason, I can jump in to help address those questions. So in terms of the round 2 numbers, they were really more tweaks. They were not substantial changes in the numbers, and so we don't anticipate the need to update the housing targets based on those numbers. And then related to the COG population projections, we work very closely with the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments using the same methodology that all the other jurisdictions in this region use to produce those projections. The other important thing to think about or to recall is that Census Bureau numbers are basically, they capture a number after the fact, whereas the projections look towards the future based off of what we know in terms of trends in population changes and as well as anticipated development. So they're kind of looking at 2 different things and from 2 different time periods, but they serve sort of different purposes, but they're both very useful pieces of data that we use. And again, our numbers and the methodology that we use to develop the forecast is the same that every other jurisdiction uses as well.
Okay, so another question here by from Mike. Thank you, Tanya, for that. Mike asks, how much damage do you think widespread single-family exclusive zoning does to housing affordability? Is it fair to argue that zoning reform could help affordability in the long run, even if it takes some time?
I can take that. I think that the initiative we are looking at today is to look, not necessarily looking at the longstanding effects of zoning reform, of zoning history, but to look forward at potential solutions. And I think what Thrive and all those pieces of the puzzle that Jason is talking about is to really put all of that together and figure out the best solution forward. Certainly, I think that we can ponder and think that 1/3 of our land is set aside for only single family zoning, and we are becoming a county that's increasingly built out. One of the studies that was shown on the slide was the residential development capacity analysis, which basically says we only have 15% of our land left, and most of our housing capacity is tied up in high density residential, which is about only 3% of their land. So certainly we are running out of land and our housing is becoming more affordable, and we're looking for strategies and solutions to make housing attainable to all income levels in Montgomery County.
Okay, we have a lot of questions pouring in here, and if we don't end up getting to all of these, we will try to post what we can on our website here. Let's see. In a follow-up to the previous question, in response, I'm not exactly sure which question this is to, so I'm just reading this here. I'm curious as to whether the decreased purchase price between detached and attached housing is primarily a function of decreased size rather than other economies.
That was, I think, the follow-up to the question about the cost of single-family home development versus multifamily home development. And that's a part of it, absolutely. I mean, another part of it is that multifamily units use less land per unit. And I'd say that, those are the two big pieces. It's less land and less space in the unit, and so it's less costly to build per unit.
Okay, one of the questions was, when will the new zoning laws come into effect in order to purchase an affordable home? So as I'll just kind of tackle that one quickly here. What we are going to ultimately propose or recommend to the county council will go to the county council in June. They will not likely take any policy proposal we send them in earnest until the fall. However, they hope to be able to work through it and adopt any changes by the end of this year. Now, sometimes it takes a little while before those things take effect, but even with these zoning changes, things change, at a pretty slow pace. So just having, the zoning in place, or even other incentives or other policies that would encourage some of the types of development that we want to see, you're not necessarily going to see that stuff happening overnight. So we need to be able to get the structures in place to be able to ensure that we have the change we want to see in the future. Okay. Lisa, how much approved housing is already in the pipeline that could meet the projected needs?
I could not answer that off the top of my head. I can certainly look up our development pipeline if someone wants to give me their email. Certainly, achieving our pipeline development is part of our strategy to meet our COG housing goals, but even if we build every single unit in that pipeline, we're still going to need to build more housing for our growing population. So it's part of the strategy, but not the only tool that we have.
And this is Gwen. If I can just add, I think that's really a point that runs through a number of these questions. This strategy, this effort isn't a standalone. We sort of said that in the presentation. We know we have to preserve existing market rate affordable housing that's out there. We know we need to do our parking lots to places initiative and build, in our activity centers and fill in our parking lots, projects like Pike and Rose and others. That's a part of this effort as well. But what we're trying to offer in this is something that we think isn't really being covered by some of our other strategies, which is creating those kind of entry-level opportunities for people to join the real estate market in the county, or for older people to downsize and live in a smaller unit, but in their own neighborhood. And, so again, this isn't a standalone. This isn't something that we're saying is the only way to meet our housing needs in the county. It's another tool in the toolkit to try to meet housing needs and to offer some options that aren't out there today. I mean, most of us have seen young people in our life wanting to buy their first, entry-level condo or their entry-level townhouse, and it's really, really hard to do. They just don't have a lot of opportunities. And we're trying to look at how we can create more opportunities, particularly near transit, but just in general. And I know, Todd, you may have some additional thoughts about that and about how this fits in with other efforts that we're doing to try to also, repurpose old office buildings or build on parking lots. We're sort of all of the above.
Absolutely. I would add to that, many of our master plans, particularly target trying to guide development to underutilized sites, such as properties that have large parking fields, as really, I think we need housing far more than we need parking at this point in time. In terms of the conversion of obsolete commercial space, that is absolutely a strategy that we're looking at. It's not a silver bullet. It's in fact very hard to convert an office building into a residential building. The needs, the mechanics, the inner workings of those types of spaces are completely different from each other. Imagine living in a cube farm, right? A cubicle system, an office system has far fewer plumbing fixtures than a residential system needs. And that's just one example. The building has to be at a very high cost, generally rebuilt, and often if they have a big floor plate, you can't get light to the interior of the building, which an office user hasn't cared for as much. Whereas, something we very much need within residential space. So not every building can be converted, but those that can. That's absolutely something that we're pushing for in our plans and trying to see more of to move obsolete commercial space into residential space.
Thanks, Todd. I'm going to be taking over the moderation point right now. I have a question that I believe will go to Director Wright, if she could answer. It says, in sector plans, local community input is far more extensive than CTA changes. Wouldn't it make more sense to attack these issues without thrusting a massive change to many areas via zoning text amendment?
So what I want to say about that very directly is that we were concerned about that as well. We had different council members looking at different ZTAs, and they were going in a bunch of different directions. And honestly, we reached out to the council and we said, let's not proceed this way. Let's turn it to planning. Let us have an opportunity to do some analysis, to develop data. We love data-driven kinds of approaches. Let us do outreach. You know, we acknowledge that ZTAs were popping up like daisies and there wasn't a whole lot of outreach going on. And we wanted very much to slow this process down, think about it logically, think about it from a data-driven approach, and just give the council some recommendations about whether the ZTA is the right way to go with this, or whether master plans are the right way to go. I mean, I don't think we as planning staff have not come to a specific conclusion in that regard. We're sort of laying out a number of different mechanisms that this could be implemented through, but we haven't made our recommendation about what's the right implementation tool. That's one of the reasons we're doing these kinds of meetings and trying to have some conversations with the community to understand the pros and cons and to understand all of the issues, so that when we do make some recommendations to the county council, they are thought through and that they have been discussed with the community, all the pros and cons of the different approaches. So, you know, I at this moment wouldn't say that a ZTA is inevitable. It certainly is one implementation tool. Doing these decisions through master plans and through rezonings is another implementation tool. And, you know, we've even talked about doing a functional master plan where we would look at, you know, the whole county and some sort of functional plan for attainable housing. So again, you know, we're at the beginning of this process. We've just earlier this month received this assignment from the council, and we're very grateful that they agreed to give us this assignment so that we can work with you all on trying to think through things in a logical, data-driven approach and come up with the best possible recommendations. But I know everyone's sort of jumping to the endpoint that, oh, it's going to be a ZTA. I don't think that that is absolutely decided at this point. I think we are being asked by the council to give them some advice on what's the right thing to do in terms of providing attainable housing and what's the right implementation tool to do that. So that's why we're here tonight.
Sorry, I was muted. You think I would know after a year to unmute myself. The next question is for Todd. And it's, why does the planning board keep telling people that if we don't accept these changes, there will be more teardowns? First, why were teardowns incompatible with neighborhoods allowed in the first place? And how can citizens expect new missing middle structures that will indeed be compatible? Nothing in the current bills requires that. So maybe if you just want to take the first part and then we can piece it out.
So I think that the planning board is not saying that these changes are needed or there will be more teardowns. I think that you know what we have shown, what we're showing through the data is that teardowns are happening now. There's nothing that prevents homes in the R60 zone from being torn down today and a 3,000 plus square foot structure built. As to the second piece, I don't think that that's what we're saying, that these incompatible homes have been allowed. I think that what we're saying is that you can make missing middle that is compatible with the type of housing that is being built today in terms of its physical form, its appearance, its impact on the neighborhood. There's a third piece to this as well. Lisa, would you refresh me on that one?
Sure. And how can citizens expect that new missing middle structures will indeed be compatible?
That's a great question, and one to which I'd say I don't have the answer for you tonight, because that's precisely part of this effort, which is to define, you know, what typologies are compatible. How do we keep controls over development such that we ensure there is high quality design that does add and enhance the neighborhood rather than detract from it. And so that, you know, that's entirely, well, that is a big part of what we are looking at through this process.
And I want to just add to that. This is Gwen again, because, you know, I'm like all about design and design excellence. And, you know, one of the things that seems to be a theme through some of the questions is an assumption that everyone's agreeing already that this should be by right. I don't think that's our absolute assumption. I think that's what we're trying, as Todd was saying, trying to study. There are pros and there are cons. You know, if we want to make it easier and overcome any market hesitancy, then having fewer regulatory restrictions will help. However, if we want to assure that it's going to be compatible, we need to have some way of assuring that. And now that could be a review process like site plan, or it could be the development of a set of guidelines and development standards that we think will maintain compatibility. So we're exploring that. And again, we don't know what that right answer is at this moment. Should it be site plan? Should it be by right with very strict development standards, almost what's called form-based code, you know, so that there's a strong expectation of what the final product will be like if they follow all the development standards in the zoning. So there are options that, again, we're going to be exploring, but what no one wants to have happen is to have a whole series of too large and incompatible kinds of new structures inserted into our wonderful neighborhoods. We want to create something that allows more diversity of housing types, yet maintains a lot of the things we love about our neighborhoods. Some of you know that I spent the first almost 20 years of my career as the historic preservation supervisor for Montgomery County. So I have seen how you can make a lot of change in a neighborhood, new construction and other kinds and additions to buildings, and yet maintain compatibility. It really is doable. It's something we do in every single one of our historic districts, and we've been doing for 40 plus years. So I think the question is, what's the best way to get there? And that's what we want to explore.
Great. Well, while I have you here, Director Wright, I have a question. Has the planning board considered trying some sector plans or partial sector plans through form-based and not Euclidean zoning?
I think we are talking about that, and I think that that's something I think that will be a discussion in the Silver Spring plan that we have going on. So I think that we are very interested in the idea of form-based codes. I think that they can make a lot of sense, and I think that we are going to be looking particularly in Silver Spring, but maybe in some of our other plans as well as to whether that tool would be effective.
Great. The next question I'm going to toss to Jason. Jason, can you share some information regarding infrastructure plans for attainable housing? That we've had discussion about entry-level jobs, attainable housing, but what about family housing and schools?
Sure. So that is, obviously a concern that people oftentimes express is the impact on infrastructure. I will say that one thing that is, this kind of presents an opportunity when you're talking about the tear down that currently gets replaced by another single family home. We actually, the policy that we have in the county, because it's a replacement of one home with another home, we don't collect impact taxes on that. And so we don't have a mechanism to kind of support the infrastructure needs. And in that case, because we're replacing one with one. But in the case where we might replace a single home with a duplex or a triplex, in that case, the impact taxes would be assessed. And so there would be an opportunity to generate additional funding for infrastructure through that the increase in the number of units there. But clearly, the growth in infrastructure policy was something that the council took through something like 20 plus work sessions, paid close attention to, and had an interest in making housing easier and ensuring that we still maintain, we still addressed our infrastructure concerns by trying to generate a little bit more funding. So on the school side, by implementing our utilization premium payments. So if an area, if a development, and even in the case of in the future, if we get duplexes, triplexes, if they're being built in an area that have overcrowded schools, then they'll have to pay more to be able to build those units.
Great, thank you. The next two questions I'm going to give to Todd. The first question is, more people are teleworking and they need space at home for an office. Is that being factored in this?
That's an interesting question. I think that in the context of missing middle and attainable housing, we're not at the point where we're looking at the square footage of prototypes of potential developments. So it's a sort of a level of detail that we haven't gotten to yet at this point.
Great, thank you. The next question is, if it is tear downs that are driving up housing costs, why not address the problem? New missing middle housing is often more costly than existing single family homes.
I'd say to round out the logic there, I think what they're implying is that why don't we hinder the development of new houses, as tear downs, to try and address this. I'd say that I have not seen a jurisdiction in America successfully have a housing strategy that involves preventing new construction of new homes and renovation of the existing housing stock. We have, so I don't see that as a viable strategy going forward.
And I'll just add, because I've been around a long time, that back in the early to mid 2000s, around 2006 or so, we had a big task force looking at the whole tear down issue. And we involved all the builders and residents, and we talked about the stormwater impacts. And we had long conversations about, what is an individual property owner's right? If they have a house, shouldn't they be allowed to expand it? If they have a larger family, shouldn't they be allowed to tear down their house and build a bigger house if they wish to have a bigger house? We ended up making some changes to the code regarding setbacks and stormwater management to address some of the more significant impacts of tear downs. But I will just say there was an enormous amount of pushback from owners of single family houses that really did not want super stringent constraints on their ability to add on to or improve their existing single family houses. And, so again, we can pull out some of those old documents from the tear down task force and the reports at that time, but I don't think that if we took it up again today, there would be a different result. I think people feel very strongly that they should be allowed to add on to their existing homes, add on or tear down and rebuild their existing home.
And I would add, this is Jason. Thank you, Gwen. I think that the comparison of the pricing is a little askew in that, you could think that a lot of these homes that are being torn down would be torn down anyway. And if they're going to be torn down and replaced with a single family home that is twice what the original home was worth, and with the sales price is twice as much, then you know, if you compare the duplex option to that as opposed to the original home, because that original home was going to get torn down. So you know, we've heard from a number of people who've said that the duplexes that might be cost more than the original home that it's being replacing. So wouldn't that, in a way, be removing an attainable home from the housing stock? Yes, but we think that home would have gone anyway, and it would have been replaced with a home twice as expensive. And so, in the outcome, what you're getting are potentially two houses that are more affordable than the house that would have been built. So this is the kind of the comparison that we're trying to look at. Great. Well, Jason, while I have you here, I have a question for you. But if these changes are not part of a master planning process, how can there be assurances that infrastructure needed will be provided? Impact taxes will not require that adequate infrastructure is provided. Well, I'm not sure how the master plan process plays into that. You know, the impact taxes would apply to the new units that would be built. So that would certainly come into play. Great, thank you. We have a bunch of questions about environmental concerns, so I'm going to pose one that I think summarizes most of them, and then I'll push it out to the group to see who wants to answer it. Environmental concerns are addressed with proximity to public transit, etc., but no one is talking about the impact of higher densities on stormwater management, which is already critical in many of the Down County neighborhoods. How is that issue being addressed? Director Wright?
Yeah, I mean, I will weigh in. Again, when we looked at the whole tear down issue back in the early to mid 2000s, one of the biggest issues that was concerning people is that when you tore down a small house and you built a larger house that covered more of the lot and had perhaps less vegetation, you were creating flooding problems for all of the neighbors. And so there were some additional regulations put into place for tear downs about how you need to address stormwater. I would say one thing that we, again, as we proceed with this, that we can talk about is, you know, in order to do attainable housing, should we be, you know, requiring additional stormwater techniques to make sure that it won't have a negative impact. One of the good things about building new is that you actually can do some of the more creative, low impact kinds of stormwater treatments, even with small developments. And I think that that's something we need to explore, because we know it's been a problem with tear downs, and we've tried to address it again back in the changes that happened during that tear down task force, but it's clearly still a problem, and I think it needs to be part of what we try to address here if we're going to move forward.
Great, thank you. I'm going to take the next question because I think I've done a little bit of research on this topic. The question is, it seems that there are housing apartment vacancies in the central business districts that are adjacent to single family neighborhoods. Will attainable housing somehow encourage occupancy of this type of housing as well? Well, I've done a lot of work on vacancy rates through the many master plans I've worked on and Thrive, and our vacancy rates in our rental buildings in the central business districts in downtown are actually pretty low. They are under 7%, and which basically means if you have a vacancy rate between 5 and 7%, that you should be building more housing. It shows that you have a constrained housing supply and that you need more housing. So certainly we need to do a better job of building more housing to encourage encourage more occupancy of housing in the county to meet the demand. Next one I'll give to Jason, because it's a fun question. This sounds like a very complicated project. How do you that you need to figure out by June? How will you work through everything we need to work through by June?
A lack of sleep, I think, is the answer, right, Lisa? So we are, we are meeting on a pretty regular basis to work through the comments that we're receiving, and we have put together a pretty tight schedule for ourselves. And we're going to do, and the thing is, fortunately, we're not starting from scratch. I mentioned all the other work that we've done before, but also we do have the draft ZTAs. Councilmember Reamer's draft ZTA, we have Councilmember Jawando's introduced ZTA, and although we may not recommend moving forward with either one or both of those, there may be elements of them that make sense, and so we have something to work off of and for us to kind of bounce off of people. So we are going to, and we recognize that even when this gets beyond the planning board and it gets passed along to the county council, that there's still time in the process to be able to tinker with things and to get things right over the course of the next few months. So as we look towards the fall and we have conversations with the council. So we think we've got a lot of people putting their kind of best foot forward on this, and we are looking at it from numerous perspectives, from the market feasibility perspective, from the incentive perspective, from the zoning perspective. So we are, we're meeting on a regular basis to try to work through this.
Thanks, Jason.
And not sleeping.
And not sleeping. The next question I'll take, and it states that the narrative is biased toward one of being forced to provide these housing types. What are the attributes of the goals of more housing choice that would make current homeowners and marginalized potential homeowners want these change? Well, I would say first, I think new housing and new residents are a net benefit for Montgomery County. Like I said, we have traditionally not provided enough housing to provide the necessary housing choices. I can give a couple examples. I think a lot of people probably listening have kids that are probably being priced out of a lot of Montgomery County neighborhoods, and smaller and more housing choices can help make that available. I would also imagine that eventually all of us are one day going to want to downsize. And the recently completed older adults housing study that was on the housing study slide said that 7 out of 10 Montgomery County residents wants to age in place. Certainly we can make adjustments to your home, but I think a lot of people will want to downsize. And I think that attainable housing is one solution to provide options for people to downsize in their neighborhoods. So I think though, there's a lot of attributes and good things about attainable housing for residents and single family homeowners. The next question I'll ask Todd, and the question is, are people going to be willing to have no or only one parking space per unit?
Thanks. Yes, in short, yes, many people are willing to have one space, and there are people who are willing to have no spaces and live without a car. It's more likely that you can go without a car and have no parking space if you have high quality transit nearby. But I think it's also absolutely the case that there are many neighborhoods in America where housing units have very few parking spaces on site, and everyone gets by with the street parking. So I'd say in short, absolutely yes.
Great, thanks, Todd. The next question is a piggyback on the question I just answered, and I'll answer this one too, and anyone feel free to jump in. And it says, as a member of a group that has historically been excluded from real estate ownership opportunities, I am interested in how attainable housing would make my entry into the real estate market in a more coveted neighborhood as an owner any more likely than it is now. When I was giving the presentation, I cited the example of the Octave, which is a condominium building that the units were small, 500 to 800 square feet, and that size afforded an affordability that's not typically found in a new single family detached or most attached structures. By doing that, the majority, I believe, was 80% of the units went to first-time home buyers. Most of them sold for under $300,000, and I think that it's part of the solution. Certainly, I think that attainable housing is not the only tool in our toolkit, as we've been mentioning today, but I think in combination with a lot of the other policies that we're recommending in Thrive Montgomery 2050, we can hopefully put a dent into our housing crisis. But thanks for your question. Let's see. Maybe Zubin, if you could answer this question. The question is, other jurisdictions that have tried these measures have not been able to show increased affordability, even for much smaller units. Evidence is needed to justify these sweeping changes, especially in already dense areas.
Yeah, I think the idea is that if you increase the stock, the prices will be, sort of controlled a little bit. But to say that this has not worked in other jurisdictions is not really accurate, because and I want to insist on the sort of just name of the thing, which is attainable housing strategies. So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach that we are taking. We're exploring multiple and hopefully creative solutions to the question of attainable housing. So I think if we increase stock and we have other creative solutions such as design changes, size of units, and just availability in different diverse neighborhoods, I think it will start showing a difference in the attainability overall. So to say that it has not worked anywhere else, there is a grain of truth in that, which has been always hard to do everywhere else too. So we are not unique in that regard. But I'm very optimistic that with some creativity, we'll get more housing stock at different price points. So this is not an effort that drives down prices overall, but it just creates availability at different price points. So it's not driving housing prices down. I mean, that's beyond a planning department's purview. What this will really do is provide a diversity of stock, which will allow people to enter at different levels. So if you enter at a certain price point and then you graduate to a different price point, we would like you to continue living in Montgomery County. So it's just creating diversity of entry points of prices within the county, and that's the goal of this project.
And if I can just add, the reason we didn't call this the Missing Middle Strategies project is missing middle does have a very specific definition of being this sort of house-sized, multiple unit kind of development, turning perhaps single-family lots into duplexes or triplexes. And that is absolutely important and worth looking at. But as we showed from that chart during the beginning of the presentation, we're looking at what I call corridor housing as well, which we see being built in places like the District of Columbia. For some reason, they're able to do it half a mile south of the Montgomery County border. Why are we not able to create some of these units like the Georgia Row development that we just described, north of the Montgomery County border, where you can actually have smaller units at a mix of price points in a compatible kind of design that fits the context and the scale of many of our larger corridors. So I know there's a huge focus on, the single family house and changing that to a duplex or a triplex, but we are really focused on a broader spectrum of different kinds of attainable housing. We're trying to not just look at this particular issue that I think a lot of folks are very honed in on. It is going to be challenging to convince a single family home owner to maybe build a duplex rather than just tearing down and building a bigger house for themselves. It is a challenge, but it may be that we get a very small scattering of those kinds of units, and they help. They provide those kinds of entry-level for sale units that people may want to buy, but that we get more of the corridor housing. And please so we're trying to keep it broad. Oh, there's something going on. We're trying to keep it broad and to look at all the options so that we can give the county council the best possible advice and recommendations. So I guess what we would say to our communities and our constituents is, broaden your thinking a little bit. This isn't just about turning single family houses into duplex. We're trying to look at something a bit broader in terms of attainability.
Thanks, Director Wright. While I have you here, will HOAs be able to prevent any of the proposed solutions from having their desired effect?
Well, there are rules that are in addition to any zoning rules that exist in the county. We have municipalities that have their own sets of rules. We have HOAs that have their own sets of rules. And if something is forbidden by an HOA, yes, that's still completely valid. The HOAs have, HOA agreements that every property owner has signed, and those are still completely valid. So, I think a little bit it's like the topics we've discussed with accessory dwelling units. When we looked at accessory dwelling units, I think everyone was saying, oh my goodness, it's going to just turn all of our neighborhoods around. It's going to change everything. Everyone's going to be building a second unit. You'll have all this change in density. I mean, the reality for these kinds of changes is that it's very self-selecting. People, choose to do it, but it's not going to change whole neighborhoods. That's why we're interested in these ideas for corridor housing as well, because we actually think that there may be some great opportunities to get more attainable housing in those corridor housing areas, and a greater quantity of attainable housing. But the bottom line is we're looking at everything. It's not a either or. We need to look at every tool.
Thank you. We have a question about building on public land, and I'll take this question, and it says, what about Mr. Scanlon's proposal that the county develop affordable housing on their land? That's referring to an op-ed that was published in the Washington Post earlier this week. And I want to say, good news, everyone. Montgomery County builds a ton of affordable housing on their land, from the Darcy and the Flats project in Bethesda to we are currently building on the former Department of Recreation site, which is an affordable housing / Mission Middle project in Bushy Drive. The county does a really good job of utilizing its assets to build affordable housing. And certainly in the future, we will continue to do so through partnerships with the county. So the next question, and I'll give it to anyone that wants it, is what role do you plan for condos as part of your strategy? Based on your charts, condos would seem to fit nicely as smaller size, more affordable, and a form of home ownership, and a far better use of limited developable land. I can take this and I can say certainly that we are looking at condos as part of our strategy. I think that you make great points that a triplex could easily be 3 ownership units under a condo structure, and we will certainly be looking at that through the scope of this project. The next question.
Lisa, I was just going to end, and there was a related question about whether, a duplex or a triplex on a current single-family lot would require subdivision, and there's the example where it wouldn't necessarily if it was set up under a condo setup.
Thanks, Jason. And we have a similar question that says, do you anticipate that a multiple unit structure will be condo or will be allowed to be subdivided for fee simple ownership? I believe that we are certainly looking at that under Councilmember Juwano's zoning text amendment 20-07. They would only be allowed under a condo structure, so you could not subdivide the land, but certainly that is one under the purview of this.
And Lisa, if I might just jump in here and note that if you have multiple units under one common roof, as in they're stacked together, and you're looking to have separate ownership of those units, as in they're for sale rather than for rent, I believe, I don't think you can do that any other way than but with some form of a condominium, because you need joint ownership over the superstructure of the building, as in it's a shared roof for everybody. So everybody needs to contribute to the upkeep and maintenance of that rather essential piece of infrastructure. And the way that we do that in this country is via the condo structure. If they are not sharing the same superstructure, the same roof, really, then you can get into the potential for subdivision versus condo.
Thanks, Todd. So we have 2 corridor questions that I'm going to give to Director Wright. The first is, where would corridor housing go? What does the planning department consider to be the corridor area? And can the county release a map of what the corridors would include?
Thanks. So as many of you know, our general plan from 1964 was called the Wedges and Corridors Plan. And what we're really doing in Thrive Montgomery 2050 is updating and modernizing that 1964 plan that has served us very well. That plan really focused on I-270 as the corridor. But we really believe that as we've grown, that we have multiple corridors. And we particularly noted these corridors when we developed our transitway or BRT plan in 2013. We have a number of corridors throughout the county that are planned in the long run to have transit, bus rapid transit. And those corridors are the ones in Thrive Montgomery that we're focusing on for additional growth. When the plan is published, we do have a map that shows all of our centers and corridors, shows where we expect to have corridor-focused growth and where we have other places where there will be much more limited growth. And of course, our rural and ag reserve are going to remain as rural and ag reserve. But Route 29 is a great example. Route 29 now has a functioning BRT that runs up and down Route 29, and it is absolutely a corridor that we want to see grow. And I think there are opportunities there for many different scales of additional development and housing along the corridor. We have opportunities for parking lots to places, in areas like the auto park and so forth, auto mall, I guess it is. But we also have opportunities for missing middle and attainable housing. So, Route 29 is an example of a corridor. You're going to, again, see a lot of this in the upcoming Thrive Montgomery 2050. One of the big idea in that is that we need to get a lot of that additional growth, those additional people who we believe are coming over the next 20, 30, 40 years in the county, and really focus them along, focus that growth along corridors.
Great. So next question is for Todd. And it states that there's no job growth in Montgomery County. Where are the jobs for all the people that need all these houses? COVID has changed how people work and use transit. What are you doing about all the empty buildings and malls in the county? Are there any plans to repurpose vacant buildings that now exist Are there any plans to repurpose vacant buildings for affordable and attainable housing? I think you already answered a little bit of this earlier, but maybe you can hit some of your high points again.
Of course. With regards to people in transit, the COVID has temporarily changed the way we live, but I think that it's not going to fundamentally change forever. That there's a lot of the way we used to live and the way we used to use our cities that we're going to happily go back to, because it actually makes us happy. It's the way we like to live, what we like to do. We like to be around people. and that major cities like Washington, D.C., just don't function without transit. And I think that we will see soon, people will go back to it when the vaccine is more widespread. That is, of course, a forecast for the future, and no one can perfectly predict that. In regards to the rest of the question, yes, it is the case that Montgomery County has not been adding jobs at a pace at the highest pace within this region, but we have been growing as a county. We are part of a region that is growing, and we're an integral part of that region. So we're a very desirable place to live. People want to live here. So I think the question seems to imply that we don't need housing, and that's just not the case at all. As to what will happen to vacant spaces such as malls that have become obsolete, office buildings that have become obsolete, we have, as a planning department, as a county, been putting in place zoning that has a high degree of flexibility in many places to enable and encourage the redevelopment of obsolete uses into structures and buildings that provide greater value to the county, to the people that want to use them, and the development community does respond to that, and is proposing to redevelop obsolete properties as they see market opportunities. And I think I've already talked to the challenges of reusing old buildings for affordable housing. In some cases, it does make sense, and in others, it's more costly than building a new building.
Great, thanks, Todd. The next question is for Jason. The specific benefits of the housing initiative to the marginalized potential buyer and the community are left out of this analysis. Why not identify and make metrics for this?
Oh, that's a tough question. I think that we haven't really come up with metrics for that exactly, unless someone else has a thought on that. But I think that what we recognize that we do have neighborhoods that could use more diversity, and so this would provide more of an opportunity for historically disadvantaged communities to be able to have potential ownership opportunities that they don't have today. And so I think, we can look to metrics that relate to how diverse our communities are, not just our housing stock, but also the residents and our schools and other aspects of our communities as metrics that would identify if we're doing this work well.
Great, thanks, Jason. The next question is for Zubin. Is there a dollar amount ceiling and bottom for what is being called attainable housing?
Yes, so we did explore this question quite a bit, and where we initially started off is at certain sort of income limits based on the 2020 income guidelines for our region. And what we started looking at initially was the sort of 80 to 120% AMI, area median income limits. And that's a complicated number because it shifts by family size. So if you are providing a 3-bedroom attainable housing unit, you could have a family of 4 in there, a family of 5 in there, or a family of 2 or 3 in there. So using that as a metric, and then further going down to monthly payments, which is where the sort of condo conversation becomes interesting, because your monthly payments, we want them to be in that 30 to 40% range. Also looking at, if you do not have a down payment, then your numbers shift. So we are exploring certain specific numbers where this attainable housing as at a price point makes sense. But we also acknowledge that we are a diverse county in more ways than one. We are also a geographically diverse county. So what is attainable in one zip code of the county may be affordable in another, and maybe unattainable in another. So we are looking at the spectrum, and we are looking at it, if you think of it as like 2 axes, which is one is geography and the other is income. And we are hoping that we can increase stock along both these axes in some way.
Thanks, Zubin. That was a great answer. The next one will be for Todd, and I think it has to do with the Silver Spring mini market study on missing middle. And it says, the Planning Board's Silver Spring marketing report makes it clear that the surveyed builders do not consider duplexes to be profitable. So people in affected neighborhoods have reason to be skeptical. In other words, if you have to incentivize builders by giving them an opportunity to fundamentally change single-family neighborhoods, why should homeowners not be quite fearful of the damage that these structures could cause? I know it's a tough question.
So the market study that was for the Silver Spring downtown and adjacent plan with regards to missing middle, did find that it would be very challenging to build duplexes in many parts of the county due to high land costs. That's not the same as saying that they're completely unprofitable everywhere. I think that the logic from that is less than that they would fundamentally change neighborhoods and the neighborhoods should be fearful of them, but more it's that they wouldn't happen because developers wouldn't be able to build them profitably. So I think that the takeaway from that is more that you'd see less change in neighborhoods rather than more. I think that the logic of the question is going the wrong direction.
Well, and I think it goes back to something that I had said earlier, which is that we aren't looking at only the idea of single-family homes becoming duplexes. We're really looking at all different possible ways of achieving attainable housing. And as we study this, we may, again, as that market study points out, we may say, we think there will be a limited number of single-family homes converted to duplexes. But when there are, perhaps, as I mentioned earlier, we should have form-based codes to make sure that they are compatible with the neighborhoods where they would be placed. And that would allow you to not have to go through a site plan process, but you would be able to proceed if you met the development standards in a form-based code. So that's one possibility, but it's not probably going to be the large majority of attainable housing. I really, again, believe the large majority of attainable housing, if we're able to achieve it, which is challenging in and of itself, is going to be along corridors and is going to be a little more at the densities of places like the Georgia Road development that we showed you a picture of earlier.
Thank you. So we have two more questions left, and the first one I'll take. It's, why do you think the uptake has been so low on accessory dwelling units? That would seem like a good option for adding housing or aging in place. I agree. I think probably the biggest issue for the accessory dwelling unit ordinance is COVID. It went into effect on January 1st, I believe 2020, and then in March we went into lockdown. So the changes that we made to the accessory dwelling unit ordinance are still very new. So we don't really know the full effect on that. That's something that we will be monitoring through as our work as planners. The next question is, in Vienna, Austria, affordable housing is considered infrastructure and is the responsibility of the government. Should we look on diverse, attainable housing in definable ways that complement all infrastructure and bring better functionality like better walkability, more local business activity? I'll give that to whoever wants to take it.
I'll just say yes. I think that that's a great idea, but it is it's a big paradigm shift for us to be thinking that way. And, I do think that, as was pointed out, we have been looking at different kinds of projects on publicly owned land that are at different price points from affordable to market rate. There have been some creative projects where the Housing Opportunities Commission has partnered with private developers to do mixed income neighborhoods. We have a great project that's near the Chevy Chase Lake future Purple Line station called the Lindley. And so there have been moves in that direction, but to do it at a larger scale, to do more of it, it really is going to be a paradigm shift. And I think it's one that we probably need to continue thinking about and considering and pushing towards.
Thank you everyone for your questions. I'm going to put our emails as the announcement. So if you have any questions or you feel that your question was missed, please feel to email us.
And Casey, if we could just go ahead and close out with, if you could share my screen again, then that has the information as well. Our email address is at least as mine, but also the web address for our website.
And please participate. Again, I just want to emphasize that the reason that we're in this whole process is because the County Council realized that they needed to take a step back from all the ZTAs that were out there and to begin looking in a logical, data-driven way at what the future should be. And we're very pleased that they asked the planning board to work on that and the planning staff to work on that. And that's why we're here. That's why we're doing these events. So please participate, come to the office hours, participate in our future community meetings. This is the chance to actually make an impact.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good night, and please feel free to email us with any questions.